Thanks very much for asking me to join you. Just to give you some broad background, I have been practicing medicine for almost 40 years. I qualified back in the 1970s, and I went through the normal hospital medicine, learning to be a consultant and so on. And then after about 10 or 12 years, I stepped sideways and I edited a medical journal for a couple of years. And that was really interesting because it gave me, as it were, a broad, comprehensive view of everything that was going on in medicine. I mean, one of the things about medicine is that it can be sort of rather over-specialized. And here I got a sort of Olympian view and saw the ways in which various things connected with each other. And in a way that that one doesn't if one is just immersed in practicing medicine the whole time. And then arising out of that, I have spent the last 20 years combining working in general practice with writing generally for the newspapers and writing books and articles. And one of the things about writing about medicine, as well as doing it, is that if you write about something, I find you have to understand it. And I don't mean that in a sort of facile way, but you have to, as it were, dig down to find out, what's really going on. And you have to be able to communicate that to other people. This is obvious in a way, but not necessarily straightforward. And then, and while I was combining general practice and writing my articles and so on, it struck me at that time that there was something very interesting going on in medicine. And I wrote about it. It was a history of medicine, of modern medicine, called the rise and called rather challengingly, the rise and fall of modern medicine. And essentially it outlined a sort of an historical view over the last 50 or 60 years of medicine, of the therapeutic revolution of the post-war years and how it came about, how we discovered all these drugs and started doing, all these phenomenal things like open heart surgery and kidney transplantation and test tube babies and so on. And how this ranked as one of the great intellectual achievements of all, with practically without parallel. And but the curious thing it occurred to me, or it seemed to me, was that although this had as it were run for about 30 years, from 1940 to the sort of 1980s, the rate of innovation had started to plateau out. The history of medicine, as it were, fell into, or as it were, the medical achievement of the last 50, 60 years falls into two quite distinct historical periods. The first 30 years, I suggested, a period of extraordinary innovation where virtually all the drugs in common use today were introduced, all the drugs for antibiotics, of course, and steroids, and drugs for psychiatric illness and rheumatoid and arthritic illnesses, and anti-cancer drugs, and so on and so on. And how this seemed to peak sometime in the early 80s. And after that, there was a tendency for a drop off in the rate of therapeutic innovation and indeed of technical innovation. And this created a certain sort of intellectual crisis in medicine, which was not sort of widely acknowledged. And so, although we continue to believe that medicine is in a continuous upward curve of progress, in fact, the last 10 or 15 years, compared to this golden age, the rate of therapeutic innovation and new developments, new ideas has been relatively reduced. And this I feel has important implications for our wider understanding of the role of science and the nature of science in our culture and in our everyday lives. Now, of course, and I, as it were, have elaborated that, both obviously in this history that I wrote, The Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine, and subsequently writing about science more generally, and specifically this, my most recent book, Too Many Pills, which is about the rise of polypharmacy over the last 10 or 15 years, where it is now not unusual for people to be taking half a dozen or more drugs, with a massive escalation in the number of prescriptions issued by family doctors, and the adverse consequences that might flow from that. So I thought the way we might do this, we might talk about this, is that I'd first start off by talking about my recent book, Too Many Pills, the problems associated with polypharmacy, and then move on to talk about the wider questions of, what is going on in science, what it is that science can explain, and what might be the genuine limitations to scientific understanding that I wrote about in a book called Why Us? How Science Rediscovered the Mystery of Ourselves.
Yeah. So I mean, that's also how I see your own trajectory. I mean, because I mean, of course, Too Many Pills is something you've written recently, but also I haven't read this book myself, but what I got my impression of it certainly seems like some of the themes of Too Many Pills have also been covered in the earlier book, the Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine, I suppose. In terms of the golden age, how it lasted until the 1970s, and then there was a gradual decline at that point. There were no new drugs coming out. I mean, no new magic bullets in that sense. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the two things are related, and I mean, so just to as it were recap. I mean, as I say, the triumph of modern medicine is one of the great. Everybody would agree that it has transformed our lives immeasurably for the better, and I am a great enthusiast for science and scientific medicine and everything that it has achieved. The difficulty is, it seems to me, that the more successful, the more powerful, and the more prestigious medicine has become, the greater the impetus to extend its influence still further, resulting in what I would call the progressive medicalization of people's lives. And this takes many forms, but the most obvious is the massive upswing in prescribing pills in the number of prescriptions issued by doctors to their patients. In Britain, for example, there have been a threefold increase in the number of prescriptions issued over the last 15 years, and that conceals a massive upswing in three categories of medication in particular. First, blood pressure lowering medication, which has increased 7-fold, drugs for the treatment of diabetes, which have increased 4-fold, and drugs for lowering statins, which have increased 20-fold. And these are, really staggering increases. So it is now not unusual for people, especially in their 60s and 70s, to be taking half a dozen or more different pills, quite different pills. And there is, of course, a hazard here, because every pill, there is no pill which doesn't have side effects in somebody or other, in one person or another. And the more pills taken, the greater the risk, the greater the hazard of adverse effects. And I first became aware of this phenomenon, really, when I write a regular column for the Daily Telegraph, weekly column, and one of my readers wrote to tell me an extraordinary story about how he had self-diagnosed himself as having an aortic aneurysm. As you know, a potentially lethal disorder, but luckily he had it. It was operated on successfully, and he a life-saving operation. But subsequently, he didn't really prosper, and he was debilitated by a whole series of adverse effects which doctors couldn't really explain: muscular aches and pains, pins and needles, general fatigue, decrepitude, and so on. And anyhow, his son was getting married in Hawaii. So he flew to Hawaii, not an easy journey, involving 2 stop-offs on the way, during which he required a wheelchair to transfer from one plane to the other. And he arrived in Hawaii, and he was going to stay there for 3 weeks, and he realized that he'd left his pills behind, his cholesterol-lowering statins. And so 3 weeks of not taking these statins, he was so recovered that he was able to walk back through Heathrow Airport when he arrived back in London. And this story of this sort of miraculous transformation of a man, of somebody who was suffering from a sort of seemed to be a chronic debilitating illness solely by the expedient of discontinuing his drugs. I wrote about this in the column, and I got about, over a period of a few months, about 5,000 letters or emails of people telling a similar story. And how astonishing it was. And it's hinted at this interesting phenomenon that there are large numbers of people out there suffering from a variety of what we usually call age-related illnesses. As I say, muscular aches and pains, fatigue, depression, insomnia, which their doctors attributed to aging, and essentially, well, you're getting on, what can you expect? But who, for one reason or other, had stopped taking their pills and had made this dramatic recovery. And that seemed to me to suggest that there was this hidden epidemic of iatrogenic. Iatrogenic means doctor-induced illness going on, which was obviously related to this phenomenon that over the past 15 years, the number of drugs issued by doctors had increased so markedly. And so that really was how it all started. Now, of course, since then, this phenomenon of the possible harm from over-treatment, over-investigation and over-treatment has become much better appreciated. But it remains deeply in the phenomenon of polypharmacy, that is prescribing lots of pills, remains deeply entrenched within routine medical practice. And so when I wrote this book, Too Many Pills, it was essentially an attempt to understand this phenomenon, how it had arisen, and why it was that nobody that people seemed so reluctant to do something about it. Now the thing is that medicine is, of course, a highly successful endeavor. We all know that. So when something goes seriously wrong like this, and we must appreciate this is a phenomenon which is now, pervasive throughout the Western world, and indeed in the rapidly all those countries like India and China and so on, whose standard of living has risen so markedly over the last few decades. When a phenomenon like this goes on, I say medicine is a highly successful endeavor, but when something goes wrong like this, and doctors start prescribing lots of pills, causing side effects in their patients, which they don't really, which they fail to appreciate, then obviously there are several factors must be involved. And very briefly, I'll just explain what the two main ones it seems to me. The first goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which I alluded to earlier, the way in which in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was this massive upswing in the number of drugs and that became available, what became known as the Therapeutic Revolution, where essentially a cornucopia of pills for every conceivable complaint or illness that you could have were discovered. And as of the 1980s, that this rate of innovation had begun to tail off. And at that time, there was a man called Henry Gadsden, who was head of Merck, who's chief executive of Merck, at the time the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. And Merck and Gadsden's interpretation was the way in which, as the rate of innovation was declining, the only way in which the pharmaceutical industry could maintain its phenomenal profitability was by what he described as growing the market. And that was to extend the range of the number of people taking pharmaceutical drugs beyond those who obviously might need them. And a classic example would be people with seriously raised blood pressure or seriously raised cholesterol levels and so on, to the millions in whom these physiological variables were only marginally raised, if at all. And that meant, in a sense, redefining the nature of illness, so that that which was considered normal in the past was perceived as being abnormal. Essentially, the line was, the thing was to, as it were, recalibrate what was considered to be normal, so that many more people became eligible for taking these pills. And that indeed is precisely what has happened. And so, for example, there was a time when, a raised blood pressure would be, 160 over 100, and then it fell to 150 over 100, then 150 over 95, then 140 over 90. And every time, as it were, one moved the variable down of what was considered to be a normal blood pressure, a further tranche of people then became eligible.
Yeah.
And it was a brilliantly ingenious solution to the problem of the declining profitability of the pharmaceutical industry, and re-energized it and reboosted profits on a prodigious scale. So that over the last 40 years, or since, as it were, this idea of extending the range of people beyond to the millions, to this much wider group of people. The profits of the pharmaceutical industry, which were always big to start with, have quadrupled. They become, staggeringly wealthy. So that was one incentive. And then the other was this idea that, which came from within medicine itself, that that indeed it was a good idea to treat lots of people with pills, because although the people most at risk from serious illnesses like stroke or heart disease were those in whom blood pressure and cholesterol was markedly raised, in fact, lots of people in whom it was only marginally raised also suffered from these illnesses. So basically, everybody should take these medicines, and that is essentially, and that is a sort of background to it. Now, one of the interesting things is that as we get older, these physiological variables of blood pressure and cholesterol and blood sugar and so on tend to increase with age. And so by the time you're in your 60s or 70s, virtually everybody becomes eligible for taking these medicines. And when you're not just taking one, but you're taking 2 or 3 or 4, then the likelihood of these adverse reactions becomes very high indeed. And against that, and the thing is that very often these, when one talks about adverse effects, these are really, they're not sort of minor side effects. They seriously affect people's quality of life. But as I say, there's a tendency to confuse the sort of the decrepitude and the symptoms that they cause with the aging process itself, and so there was a tendency to overlook the possibility that it might be the drugs which are causing these illnesses and these symptoms, and that by discontinuing the drugs, one could produce this miraculous transformation in people's quality of life.
Yeah. And of course, this is also because of polypharmacy that you're unable to say which drug is causing the side effect, and of course, in an old age as well. These are all confounding factors in that sense, and it becomes.
Yes, that's right. I think that is, you're absolutely right. Firstly, of course, that this is really a problem for those in their 70s or beyond, but of course they are an expanding numbers of the population, and the older you get, the more likely you are to suffer from adverse effects, because you have difficulty in metabolizing the drugs, or for any other number of reasons. And secondly, you will anyhow be taking a variety of other medicines to treat specific symptoms. So if you have arthritis, you'll be taking anti-inflammatory pills, or if you have some blood thinning problem, you take medicines for that, and so on. And cumulatively together, the likelihood of them causing adverse effects becomes very high indeed. The difficulty is, of course, twofold, really. Firstly, this phenomenon of polypharmacy. There is an enormous financial investment in the promotion of polypharmacy. And which is the first one. And the second is that doctors very often find it difficult to acknowledge that what they have been doing was been harmful to their patients. And so these two factors combined have made it very difficult to, as it were, put the problem of polypharmacy on the agenda and to encourage people, doctors generally, to reduce the number of pills that their patients are taking. And it's underpinned by what I realized, or came to realize, was a concerted effort, mainly inspired by the pharmaceutical industry, to present these drugs as being vastly more effective than they really were. And they used, because of course, you know, there would be these vast, large clinical trials in which people are given these drugs and the outcome compared with those who aren't taking them. And when you do these clinical trials, it appears that these drugs are, you know, really very effective and then everybody should be taking them. But it's predicated on an extraordinary piece of statistical sophistry, where if you examine the results of these clinical trials, what you find is that that the actual benefits of these medicines are exaggerated almost 50-fold. Now, you know, it's difficult to just, you know, just talking like this to explain how this comes about. But essentially, I'll give you an example. If, for example, you know, taking a cholesterol reducing drugs reduces your risk of a heart attack from 2% to 1%, then the absolute benefit is, of course, 1%. That means that 1 in 100 people taking this drug will benefit from it. But if you reduce 2% to 1%, you're also halving the risk. So you could equally argue that it reduces the risk of having a heart attack by 50%. And in terms of what the, you know, the ordinary person taking these medicines are concerned, is obviously they want to know, what is the absolute chance that this will reduce my risk of having a heart attack? Whereas the way in which it is presented to them is what is known as the relative risk. So they're told it will reduce your risk of having a heart attack by 50%, whereas in absolute terms it's 1%. And that, of course, is an enormous difference, obviously, but it also influences the whole cost-benefit analysis of taking drugs generally. If indeed taking medicines, taking a drug reduced your risk of having a heart attack by 50%, you might be prepared to say, right, I'll go for that, even though it causes some adverse effects. But if in absolute terms it's only 1%, then, you know, perhaps it's not worth putting up with those muscular aches and pains or the insomnia or the fatigue and so on. And the way in which this phenomenon of polypharmacy has arisen is predicated on this systematic exaggeration of the way in which these statistics are presented, such that, you know, most doctors themselves are unaware of what the marginal benefit that they can confer, and this, as it were, and so and getting, as it were, and so are very disinclined to be cautious, or indeed to advise that their patients stop taking their medication. So we have this sort of curious situation now where, in a sense, everybody knows there's a problem. There's a survey of GPs in general practitioners in Britain 4 years ago found that 9 out of 10 admitted that they prescribed too many medicines to their patients. And so people know it's a problem. And indeed, of course, if you happen to be somebody who is taking lots of pills, then the inconvenience of taking them, the side effects that they cause, is seriously affects their quality of life.
Can I just focus on one issue that you raised right now about, I mean, for example, how statins are marketed, and I mean, as you're mentioning that the relative risk is what is highlighted instead of the absolute risk, and but isn't this common knowledge now, and shouldn't it not be affecting people at this point? Because I mean, it seems to be a very common example. I mean, taken everywhere. It's even there in our textbooks now. So aren't doctors more aware in that sense of this, or is it still able to exert its influence?
Well, there is
especially in the I mean upon doctors itself. I mean, are doctors I mean becoming more aware?
Well, I think the situation in Britain is complicated by the fact that in part that over the last 10 years doctors have become financially incentivized for prescribing these drugs, and this is a complex business to describe, but essentially and I'm sure that the situation might well be applies not only in Britain but across the world, that there was the idea that rather than in the state system rewarding doctors for being doctors and looking after their patients in the best way that they thought appropriate and so on, the idea arose that they should be paid for results, and that particularly for their success in hitting certain targets. And this is this notion of target culture is, of course, a common, a modern phenomenon, but very pervasive. So that the idea being that it would incentivize doctors to practice better medicine, to be more thorough, to be more systematic. But if you're going to pay people on the basis of results, you have to have some sort of criteria of, what is the target that you're setting them, and that means that it has in some way to be measurable. You can't pay doctors for being nice or sympathetic or good diagnosticians or or any of the other of the many things that doctors are involved in. You can't pay them for being good at being doctors, but you can pay them if they, depending upon the number of their patients in whom they have diagnosed, for example, hypertension, and their success in reducing their blood pressure down to a certain target, a preset target. This idea has become very pervasive. And so doctors are financially encouraged to prescribe medicines in order to lower their patients' blood pressure or cholesterol or whatever it might be. Even though there might be, as it were, some other way of doing it. For example, if both slightly raised blood pressure and cholesterol level is associated with being overweight. But it's much easier to prescribe pills to lower those indices than to encourage somebody to lose weight. And so you prescribe the pills. So that's one thing. And the second problem is, and I might have, just to mention this again, is that as you get older, so these indices rise. So the blood pressure and the cholesterol tends to rise with age. And so you find the situation where the easiest way for a doctor to maximize their income is to focus on their 70 and 80-year-old patients, measure their blood pressure, measure their cholesterol, decree that they're too high, and put them on pills to lower them. This is I think there are two problems here. There's two further problems here. The first, there is a credibility problem, which is that when you explain this to people, they say that can't possibly be true. In a sense, it's so, it's such a catastrophe. The consequences of over-medication, over-medicalization, especially of the elderly, that people are either can't find it hard to believe, and doctors are reluctant to acknowledge that what they've been doing is wrong. And so this phenomenon of polypharmacy becoming deeply entrenched within routine medical practice is an incredibly difficult one to extirpate. And I wrote my book, Too Many Pills, in which I cite the examples we've talked about, but also others, the overuse of bone strengthening drugs for prevention of osteoporosis, particularly the use of preventive medicines after a heart attack, and the overuse and overprescription of diabetes drugs, when, especially for type 2 diabetes, when the simple expedient of losing a stone or two of weight can, as it were, essentially cure this condition. I wrote the book because I felt that actually nothing was going to change. And that the only way in which, as it were, one could partially resolve the problem was, as it were, to reach beyond, not to try necessarily to influence one's colleagues, but to reach a wider audience, so that people had an understanding of what was going on and could make up their own minds about whether or not they should be taking their pills, and to make that very crucial connection that, perhaps their fatigue or their falls or whatever it might be related to the pills that they're taking. And it is, of course, this is not the first time that doctors have got things wrong. I mean, one can think back to that time when, back in the 1950s, when parents were encouraged to lay their babies face down when they were asleep, and how, rather than lying on their side or on their backs, and how this was associated with this massive escalation in incidence of sudden infant death syndrome in babies, and where they would be found dead in their cot, aged 3 months or whatever it might be, and a catastrophe, of course, for everybody involved and the parents and so on. And that the connection between sleeping position and sudden infant death syndrome was recognized back in the, in the early 50s, but it took the best part of 10 years before, that official advice was reversed. And again, this touches on this thing about, the prestige and the authority of medicine generally, the presumption that if doctors say this is what you should be doing, you should be doing it. And along the lines of, they must know what they're talking about. Surely these drugs have all been tested. It can't possibly be true that it's causing this epidemic of iatrogenic illness and so on. I mean, I'd like to believe that doctors are now a bit more hesitant than they were, and there is indeed a sort of campaign for what's known as deprescribing, the notion that essentially the fewer pills you take, the better. But the fact remains that you go to an ordinary, a care home, or the elderly who've and you'll find, people in their 90s taking, cholesterol-lowering statins as if somehow this were going to have any effect on the prospect or their quality of life. And I suspect that part, at least, of this, the catastrophe of the COVID epidemic and its effect on the elderly and care homes is related, not unrelated, to the fact that they are debilitated by taking all these unnecessary pills. But we'll have to see.
So I mean, there's actually so many points that we can pick up on, but I just want to, before moving forward, I just want to ask, how are we doing on time? Do you think we should move to the second topic soon?
Yes, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Just last 1 or 2 questions I'd like to ask you about this, the present discussion. You were speaking about the reason that you found, instead of actually working within the medical, fraternity. I mean, in one sense, you say that, I mean, there is a limit to how much they can achieve. So it would be more helpful to inform the general public or the patient himself or herself. And in this sense, what would you say about the entire movement of evidence-based medicine, or the enterprise of evidence-based medicine? I mean, is it helpful in these regards, or I mean, is there some hope that it can help in these regards?
It all depends, I suppose, what one cites as evidence-based medicine, because you could say that the this 50-fold overestimation of the benefit of these drugs, for example, as presented in clinical trials, one would say, that is evidence-based medicine. Yes, indeed, it does reduce the relative risk of having a heart attack by 50%. I think there's a problem here of an over-allegiance to, as it were, what statistics can apparently demonstrate in the statistics of clinical trial, over and above what one might call old-fashioned medical common sense. So, by which I mean that, had you said to a doctor, 30 years ago, all your 80-year-old patients should be taking, half a dozen different pills, because that will mean they would live longer and better lives, the standard response would be, I would imagine, you must be joking. Because it was sort of common sense that, indeed, when I was at medical school, we were advised that we should have to think very carefully before we prescribed any medicines to somebody in their 70s and 80s because of the hazards of side effects. But that old-fashioned commonsensical view has been subverted. What you would call good old-fashioned clinical common sense has been subverted by what one might call the tyranny of statistically based medicine, where the truth is only to be found by administering drugs to thousands of people, of heterogeneous group of people in a clinical trial, and some or other trying to drag out of the results something which resembles evidence of clinical benefit or significance. So from that point of view, we are, medicine has, which has, one could say, has sort of lost the plot. And what in the past would common sense would dictate has been overridden by by people presenting statistics on a piece of paper and saying, well, look at this, as I say, when that is synergized with doctors being financially incentivized for treating their patients, it's a pretty toxic cocktail.
Yeah, and finally, also about deprescribing. I also recently had a podcast with a person known as Jacob Stegenga. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. He works in the philosophy of medicine department in the University of Cambridge. And he's recently written a book called Medical Nihilism.
Oh, yes.
I mean, his what he highlights are more on the kind of the methodological faults in medical research. So the methodology or the methods themselves are biased towards, I mean, against giving you a fair picture. But I mean, especially in something like deprescribing, it seems like we need more systematic studies of how that can be supposed, because we have more studies about getting people onto drugs, but perhaps lesser of how we can get off drugs once, I mean, after a certain point. I mean, would you say that that's fair to say, or?
Yes, no, I think, I mean, I mean, there have been some trials and investigations of deprescribing, as you know, taking people off pills. But compared to the numbers encouraging people to put on pills, they're pretty few and far between, which in a sense is rather surprising, one might think. But against that, one has to realize that organizing clinical trials is an incredibly expensive business. And the only people who can really afford to do it are the pharmaceutical industry.
Sure.
And, you would have thought that, organizations like the National Institute of Health or the Medical Research Council here in Britain would be able to orchestrate, a trial of deprescribing, taking one group of people who are taking 6 pills a day and leaving them on them, and then comparing it with another group who aren't taking them and seeing the outcome. But that hasn't really happened. There have been some small trials in Israel where, the results really are, quite dramatic, where over a period of a year or 2 years, mortality rate falls by 40% or 50%. And you'd think, well, people should sit up and take notice of that. But so far, it hasn't really happened. And one of the things I think partly, I mean, is that partly perhaps it's political in the sense that, were you to have a properly organized trial of the sort I describe, its results would be so dramatic, you would expect people to, would be, embarrassed by the outcome and so on. I mean, what you can do is you can infer from other situations the way in which this might be the adverse effects, and use that as evidence for deprescribing. For example, in Britain, the number of elderly people admitted with severe head injuries has increased tenfold in the last 15 years. And that is down to 2 things. Firstly, that they are on blood pressure lowering medicines, which excessively lower their blood pressure, so predisposing them to falls. And secondly, that they're on blood thinning medicines, so when they do fall and hit their, bang their head, they could bleed into the brain and so on. Now, this is obviously, a very serious situation, and you can. The difficulty is transferring that information. So if you are, for example, a neurosurgeon, you see lots of these patients coming in and you realize that, the problems are partly related to polypharmacy, translating that to, as it were, mainstream evidence guidelines. And medicine is now full of guidelines, and they've been, and they have been written up by eminent specialists and experts. We have there's an organization here in Britain called the National Institute for Care and Health Excellence, NICE. But for deprescribing to really become a major phenomenon, it would require all these eminent experts and so on to say, well, actually, we were wrong about that, and that those guidelines are incorrect, and that although there is marginal evidence of benefit for some people taking blood pressure lowering medicines when they're very old, actually it does not, or it is more than offset by the harm that it can cause. And quite frankly, I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, in this whole scenario, do you think there's any scope for doctors to go against the system, or I mean, is that not a practical option in the UK, for example?
Yes, I mean, I think that you can. You can use your own judgment, and you're entitled to do so. But they are, you know, you can see the way in which people are padlocked into the system.
Yeah.
And so if, for example, you say, well, I don't really think you should be taking these blood pressure lowering pills, and then, you know, a year later or 18 months later, the patient has a stroke, then you become vulnerable to litigation. You know, why didn't you prescribe those pills, and so on. And so the room for, you know, individual maneuver is rather limited outside a redrafting of those recommendations, in which it becomes generally acknowledged that there is a massive cost-benefit equation going on here, and it is reasonable to reduce the number of medicines that people are taking in anticipation that this will improve their quality of life.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's of course, I mean, so much on this one topic itself that we can continue on this. I mean, for the next half of the session as well. But of course, we also need to touch upon your other work, Why Us, and just to, I mean, give my own impression of reading that book. I mean, you, I mean, as the subtitle of the book says, that, you know, this is about how science has rediscovered the mystery of life, the mysterious, or the wonder of life. And this is, of course, about I mean, how do you want to go about this discussion? I'm thinking mostly about discussing, for example, two aspects over here. One is the I mean, in both cases where naturalism or materialism reaches an impasse, and where you're led to, you know, appeal to this idea of basically this dual nature of reality, that there's not just a material but also a mental or you know, mind based reality. And I mean, this is a conclusion that you come to on two aspects. I mean, primarily, it is in terms of explaining the telos of evolution itself, I suppose. The hidden design behind evolution. I mean, which couldn't be explained in strictly materialistic terms, but and also, of course, in terms of when you're speaking about consciousness. I mean, how the brain does not, I mean, I mean, explain away consciousness. I mean, as of course Raymond Tallis also speaks about that.
Yes.
That what he says is that the brain is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for consciousness. So, I mean, in that sense, um, these are two. I'd like you to speak about these two aspects. I mean, why you think that we need to appeal to this kind of dual nature of reality, or this at least this non-material nature of reality as well. And
Yes. If I could just give a bit of background,
sure.
And then move on to your. And I think we start with the fact that over the last 50 years or so, science has far eclipsed philosophy and theology and history to become, as it were, the dominant way of knowing. And this takes several forms. The notion that, the scientific method is the only way in which you can identify truth. That things which, as it were, that don't fall within the scientific domain are of secondary significance or secondary importance. The notion that there's nothing principle that science cannot explain. And the notion that, in a sense, science offers us salvation, that through science, through progress, that is the only way in which we can solve the problems. And this is an incredibly persuasive, dominant phenomenon, and is predicated on something which people don't appreciate as much as they do, or should do, which is that over the last 60 years, science has permitted us, for the first time in the history of our species, to understand the whole history of the universe from the moment that it started till yesterday. And that, by which I mean that in my lifetime, within living memory, as it were, we have discovered how the universe came into existence, the Big Bang, how the stars were formed, how our solar system was formed, how our Earth came into existence, how its life-sustaining atmosphere was formed, how the plate tectonics, how its geology and geography was formed, and and on top of that, we've cracked the genetic code and understood all those genetic instructions down the strung out along the double helix, how they dictate how things are, how we are, and we have an understanding of the nature of human evolution, and plausible explanation of a series of explanation of, as it were, the ascent of man from a relatively primitive hominid to our species nowadays. Now, this, of course, is a staggering, monumental achievement. And as I say, it allows us to hold this whole thing in our mind's eye. And you think, well, that intellectual achievement can never be surpassed. You can never rediscover that. And it's happened in the very recent past. And that is why science has eclipsed the humanities. And there's nothing in philosophy or theology or history which begins to touch that. That is why science has become so important. And yet, it leaves unresolved two great issues. And essentially, the last 20, 30 years of science has been an attempt to resolve those issues. And they are, first, how it is that those genes strung out along the double helix dictate the near infinite variety of form and attributes of the living world, and how it is that the electrochemistry of the brain, the physical electrochemistry of the brain, translates into our everyday experience of being in the world, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and so on. And so, leaving aside, and essentially the great endeavor of science, of big science, over the last 20 years has been to resolve those two questions on two bases. First, the ability to sequence genes, to spell out the whole sequence of genes in thousands of different organisms and discern how they are different from each other, and how that might in its turn explain the phenomenon of evolution and how it is that creatures are so different from each other, what it is that distinguishes a human from a fly, for example. And the second is neuroscience, and particularly the ability to observe the brain from the inside out with the sophisticated scanning techniques, which allow you to, as it were, study the brain and how the brain is working while people are thinking or imagining or speaking or talking or whatever it might be. And that's, and as it were, once as it were, this would, as it were, complete that story of our understanding of ourselves and our role in the universe. But peculiarly, but interestingly, but importantly, the most important finding or significant finding of these two major projects, genomics and neuroscience, of the last, is that these questions remain completely unresolved in a way in which they might seem to be irresoluble. But I mean that for all that we might know of the history of the universe, these last fundamental questions lie beyond science's grasp. And that, of course, is an extravagant claim, but I mean, I'll give you, if we deal with them separately, the whole principle of, starting with genomics, the principle of genomics was predicated on the notion that if you can spell out all the genes that are strung out along the double helix, by which that one would be able to distinguish not only why it is that humans are different from flies, but also, or flies different from humans, but also how it is that through the process of evolution, natural selection, acting on the random mutation of those genes, how it is that evolution has happened, the mechanism of evolution. And that, of course, is a fundamental issue, because while one could say that there's no denying the phenomenon of evolution, that is, the whole history of the universe is a history of the evolution from the simple to the complex. The claim of biology has been that we actually understand the mechanism. We understand how it happens. And that is what genomics should have given the answer to. But right from the beginning, it was apparent it was not going to. Because once scientists had started spelling out these genomes, it became apparent, first of all, that there was a relative paucity of genes, for us humans 20,000, but also that they were bizarrely, that there were an equivalent number between ourselves and a millimeter long worm. We have precisely the same number of genes as Stereonotus elegans, a 1 millimeter long worm. And that, of course, is the least, is not what would be expected. And what it emerges, or what has become clear, is that while we, like a worm, share the same number of genes involved for the making of proteins, the building blocks of life, along with all other creatures, the difficult question of what it is that distinguishes us from a worm or a fly remains unresolved. Yeah. And this is, as it were, the elephant in the room. And so what's happened is that the discipline of genomics, of spelling out the sequence of genes, is virtually limitless, because you could, if you wished, to sequence the genome of every creature on the planet, and every plant, and every bacterium, and whatever it might be. But it wouldn't take you any further in explaining why it is that, a fly has, 2 wings, 4 legs, and a brain the size of a full stop. And we have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a brain that can encompass the origins of the universe. And so this is, so as it were, you have this feeling that, science has taken you so far. But when you come to the really important question, and this, of course, is a question that has always fascinated philosophers and been a major intimation of the notion that there is more than we can know, the beauty and wonder and richness and diversity of the world in which we inhabit, that remains unexplained. It remains beyond the power of science as we understand it to explain. And what you can't emphasize strongly is that there is nowhere further to go. The history of science, or biology, in a sense, has been, over the last 400 years, of understanding ourselves to a profounder and a profounder level. So you start with the whole body, and then you have the organs and the tissues and the cells, and then you get down to the genetic code within the cells, and you sequence that. And you can't go any further than that. And you are left with, just one vast enigma of how can this be? And that is, and one, from that one might infer that these questions, as it were, lie outside the domain of science to understand. No.
So, would you say, that this is outside the domain of science because this is dealing with a nature which which is not the I mean, within the routine kind of scientific measure. I mean, what science, because science measures the material world and it cannot measure this non-material reality, which perhaps is what is being.
Well, I mean, one might infer that there is something more going on than is explicable in materialistic terms, in what can be measured by science. I mean, I don't think one has to hypothesize what that other thing might be.
Yeah.
But we are, I think it has brought to our attention very strongly that the complexity of life is such, whether in its totality or the level of the cell, for example, that it defies reductionist explanation. And you know, I mean, I personally don't have any problem with this, you know. So science can explain the material world to a greater or lesser extent, but you know, when it comes to living in the world and experiencing that infinite diversity of form and attributes of all the creatures in the natural world in which we inhabit, I don't have any difficulty with science not being able to explain it. But I would infer that there is, as it were, that has to be taken at face value, and it's legitimate to infer philosophically from it that there is or could be a higher intelligence, but there could that are, you know, that the phenomenon of life is ultimately a mystery, and will remain so, and that we shouldn't go around thinking or pretending to ourselves that you know, it's only a matter of time before, you know, science sorts this problem out. I think it becomes, you know, that becomes even more of an issue in relation when one starts thinking about the brain and the mind.
Yeah.
Because one of the findings of neuroscience is that of all those neuroscientific studies of scanning and so on, is that, you know, their findings are also, you know, have also proved to be similarly inscrutable. I mean, I give you one example. I think of the, you know, the simplest task one could ask someone to do. For example, to associate, to get them to associate in their mind the notion of a chair and sitting on it, as we are now. Well, if you scan the brain of somebody looking at a chair, you know, the relevant bit of the brain involved in vision lights up, you know. It's obviously the person is looking at a chair. And if you ask somebody to think about what you do on a chair, the bit of the brain involved in thinking about sitting on a chair lights up. But if you ask them to associate the word sitting with chair, then astonishingly, practically the whole brain lights up. And so here we have one of the simplest tasks conceivable. And yet it would seem that all these sort of discrete parts of the brain are all collectively involved in realizing it. And so that notion that, you know, you would find this bit of the brain does this, and that bit of the brain does that, and that bit of the brain does that. And then if you put them all together, that is, as it were, that explains how we experience being in the world, is not how it appears the brain works. And that, you know, is, you know, completely unexplained. But just to go a bit further than that, thinking about what is entailed in being in the world and being conscious and sitting and thinking and living our daily lives, is that it has become apparent that for all that one might be able to talk about or visualize the brain in action, you can't get to that experience of what it is like to be in the world. That is non-translatable. And in a sense, one might think that is, you know, perhaps predictable. But the point about, I think, neuroscience over the last 20 years is that it's forced us, in a way, to recognize it more concretely than ever before. And that all those aspects of our lives that, as it were, make life worth living, that is our sensory experience of seeing and hearing and listening and to the world, memorizing the faculty of memory, the faculty of free will, the sense of who you are as a person, who your personality, which remains constant over years but matures and changes. That experience just seems to lie beyond the grasp of science, neuroscience, and you can't again envisage how it might be that science could explain that. So, I mean, I think the two, for what it's worth, I mean, the philosophical significance of this, I think, is that
when you, for example, when you talk about this, well, I mean, this seems to suggest that there's something beyond the material, I mean, what the purely material world offers us, right? Or
yes, I mean, I think that is my point. A reasonable inference that these are ultimate questions which lie beyond the power of materialist science to explain, i.e., there is more to life than the material. And, you know, the only way in which we can conceive of that is in a sort of a dualistic way, that there is, as it were, the material world that can be known and measured and scrutinized and investigated by science. and there is another non-material world, which, as it were, imposes order, which, as it were, defines the way in which we experience that world, and that it somehow or other it is, and that it is immensely potent. It can't be, you can't pin it down, but it's important to draw the conclusion that if indeed life is a mystery and our existence is a mystery, that there is more than we can know, that, as it were, is an intimation of a higher or a different existence, that we should defer to or take into consideration, or whatever it might be. Yeah.
So this actually also reminds me of another book by this the philosopher Thomas Nagel. I'm sure you're aware of his book Mind and
Cosmos. Yeah.
I mean, he seems to be coming at the same conclusion that you're talking about over here. That in terms of both of these aspects, in terms of Neo-Darwinism explaining, as an explanation, as well as the insufficiency of neuroscience to explain away consciousness. I mean, in both of these aspects, it seems that these theories are limited, or they're reaching their limitations, and we need to reach for something beyond.
Well, perhaps we need to reach for something beyond. I mean, I think the problem is, in terms of the way in which people view the world, is that the presumption that science understands these things, or could in theory understand them, means that people feel that the world is a much simpler place than it really is. And it, it sort of bypasses intellectual inquiry. So, so to deal with, which is Nagel's comment, point of the relationship between brain and mind. It changes the way, I think, one views the world. If you say, no, that for all that we might know, this is something that can't be explained away, that it's not just that the brain is the most complex phenomenon in the universe, and how did that come about, but that the mind that the brain, as it were, gives rise to has its ability to comprehend the nature of the world that we live in is something which is so utterly extraordinary that that it is that not to recognize that is, as it were, to miss out on a fundamental truth about our existence. And And that was, I think, why, we live, in that sense, in a very, a really fascinating period where it takes, one could imagine it would take some time to assimilate it. But, this combination of both, on the one hand, science's supreme achievement in understanding the history of the universe, and on the other hand, that simultaneously it has revealed the essential inscrutability of these two really important things. It's that is going to take some time to take on board, and for people to come to terms with. But it is, I mean, I think it's pretty devastating. Yeah. And one of the ways in which I think about it is that if you read sort of, very conventional textbook about biology, textbook about whatever it might be, flies or worms or birds or there is, no, sorry, I'll leave it there. Sorry, I didn't want to.
Yeah, this is.
I'm just repeating myself.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is. I mean, that's an important point that you also mentioned in your book. That I mean, the way we are, the way scientific education is imparted to us becomes more. I mean, that sense of wonder is missing over there. That curiosity or that intellectual wonder and openness. I mean, again,
the trouble is, yeah, I mean, it tends to bypass intellectual inquiry.
Yeah.
And
I suppose it becomes a dogma in itself, or it's taken as a dogma, and it's not. Openness is not entertainment.
I think. I mean, wonder is I think the great elixir of life, as it were. The notion that these are not things that we can, reduce to a simple formula or pinpoint down. That the way in which we should view the world is, when you look at a sunset, is to say, wow, how can it be that the world is so beautiful? Or when you, listen to an amazing piece of music by Bach, to say, how can it be that the human mind can create something of such perfection and of such deep emotion and profundity and timelessness and all that sort of thing, and to, as it were, relish that and see it for what it is, that it represents, or that it is both the sunset and the Bach cantata are part of, a wider world that.
Yeah, I suppose we can conclude with that thought as well. That I mean, the sense of of sustaining wonder is important. Yeah.
I mean, at the heart of it, I suppose, is a theological argument, and all the main religions are predicated on, as I say, there being more than we can know, there being a higher intelligence. And the main evidence for that historically has always been that we live in a world of, sublime beauty and interconnectedness that lies beyond our powers to comprehend, and that the human mind is a God-given faculty or attribute which allows us to acknowledge that there is something greater than we can know. So one could, if one wished, infer if paradoxically, the main findings of genomics and neuroscience in the last few years has to provide, as it were, theoretical, empirical evidence for the theistic argument and the return of God, and into as part of people's ordinary discourse.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, that itself should be taken with that kind of intellectual openness, and I mean that the other extreme is that itself also becomes a dogma.
Yes, of course, I take that, but I don't think one should, but this is the paradox.
Yeah,
that science that was going to explain the world has ended up pointing to its profound inexplicability, as it were.